It seems to be human nature. If you are severely repressed, the natural response is rage. And there will be people that do military resistance, that try to follow ethics, that try to follow international law, and there will be some that do not. The sooner we can stop the oppression, the sooner we can let the rage become less and let people have their independence.
Hi, this is Aisha Hauser. I'm a minister at the Church of the Larger Fellowship, and this is our podcast. I wanted to thank you for joining us today. I hope this inspires you, hope it builds your faith, hope it gives you perspective to experience the power of Unitarian Universalism at work in your life. Enjoy the message.
Greetings, beloved. Welcome to the Voices of Unitarian Universalism, The View. My name is the Reverend Dr. Michael Tino, and I am your only host today. So because it's just me and our guest, I think we'll just get right to this conversation today. Last week on The View, we began a conversation among our hosts about what is going on right now in Israel and Palestine. And we had some ground rules that we set for ourselves in that conversation. One is that we center love for humanity and the inherent worth and dignity of all people in our work. And we center liberation for all people in our work. That's one rule. The second is that we believe that it is possible to talk about this situation in ways that uplift humanity and that do not devolve into either anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or anti-Palestinian rhetoric, because those things dehumanize people, and we don't go there. We believe that it is possible to criticize the actions of the state of Israel without being anti-Semitic, and it is possible to criticize the actions of Hamas without being anti-Palestinian, and we're going to do our best to continue doing those things today. And so let me introduce our guest. Today on The View, we have Dana Fisher Ashrawi. Dana is a third generation Unitarian Universalist who is a distant cousin of abolitionist minister, the Reverend Theodore Parker, 19th century Unitarian minister. She lives on unceded Sana land near Houston, Texas. Dana is married to a Palestinian who was raised in a Christian family in Jerusalem. They have 3 young adult children and a dog named Scooby-Doo. Dana is the current president of Unitarian Universalists for Justice in the Middle East, which was established in 1971 to educate Unitarian Universalists and which sides with love with the people of Palestine and Israel. UUJME is a related social justice organization of the UUA. Dana is also an active volunteer with the Tapestry UU Church in Houston and with the Texas UU Justice Ministry, and is also a board member of the Arab American Educational Foundation, which has established 2 university chairs and a Center for Arab Studies. Welcome, Dana. It is so good to have you here with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I think just reading your bio, maybe an interesting place to start is noting that you have family in Jerusalem. Are they still Christians in Jerusalem, Palestinian Christians?
Well, we do have some cousins in Jerusalem that actually come from Nazareth, and my spouse's family originates in Nazareth. But we have family actually also in Ramallah, which in a normal world, it would be a 25-minute drive from Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And and it's just a really tough situation for everybody right now.
Yeah. I read an article just this morning about the rise in violence in the West Bank as well. And so I hope that your family continues to be safe there.
Thank you.
I imagine this is a very personal conversation if you have family that you talk to every other day who are there.
Yeah, it definitely is. And my children is so interesting to me. I've been big about telling them about my side of the family and our history and heritage, and they somewhat identify with the European American part, but they seem to more strongly identify as Palestinian American. And they're very distraught, very hard to focus on work. It's a tough time.
And so, what have you heard or learned from your family or from other sources about the tensions that are ongoing there?
Some interesting things that maybe didn't make it into the mainstream news very much. There are maybe 20,000 Gazans with work permits to go into Israel and do jobs. And what I heard is about 17,000 Gaza workers were rounded up by the military and just dumped in Ramallah and other towns in the West Bank. So people were having to rush and put them up in high school gymnasiums, church auditoriums. And then military came back and arrested about 2,000 of them. So they're being held without charge in prison settings for, the state would probably say, security concerns. This is not really new for Palestinians, however, because when the British occupied the area, they used administrative detention for people that they felt were politically unacceptable. So this is when you get arrested and you get held without charge, sometimes indefinitely. And there are a couple of thousand Palestinians that are held in jails today with no charge. As a majority, I'd say Unitarian Universalists are very concerned about prisons and imprisonment. And I think we need to think about Palestinians in that regard too, that there's so much prison abuse that is going on. And some people compare the whole Gaza Strip to an open air prison. What I've heard from my Israeli Jewish friend, Sahar, who is a longtime activist, is that it is so hard to go out on the street as a Jewish person and push for even a ceasefire, that there's so much emotion. And also, as most of us know, the government of Israel has become very right-wing in the past few years. So there's just this push to war and revenge. And so the people that are going out and saying, how about a ceasefire? That's the best way to save the hostages. They are getting attacked. There was an Israeli Jewish journalist whose apartment was attacked by a mob because he dared to write about that we should do a ceasefire. He had to send his children and spouse to hiding, and he himself is in hiding as well. So that's the climate that people are facing there. And as you had said, there are more attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. I think about 200 Palestinians have been shot and killed just during this almost 4 weeks of the current catastrophe. And this is settlers and soldiers going in, and even at a funeral for someone that was shot, a couple of people were shot and killed. And it's disturbing to hear about. It's very upsetting, and it's just a terrible situation getting worse. And it's not new, it's just escalated. It's been going on since the 1930s and 1940s, and it's just now escalated. We can even look up what Blinken, our Secretary of State, proposed in a meeting in Egypt, this idea of ethnically cleansing the Gaza Palestinians and moving them to the Sinai Desert in tents, which is unacceptable to the Palestinian people. They want to stay on their land. And there's even a proposal that Biden had to move the Palestinians from the West Bank into Jordan, which is also ethnic cleansing. And that's the main reason that the King of Jordan would not meet with him when he went to Israel. So I think it's a time of very high emotions for everybody that cares about this situation. And I think one way that I try to cope and that I recommend is to try to resort to looking at facts and looking at realities, taking care of my heart, and just trying to say, okay, let me not let emotion take over. Not to say that we shouldn't feel our feelings, but we have to be aware that when we allow emotions to rule, then we can't see reality, and it makes it hard for us to make progress. And I think as a faith, I really appreciate what our president, Reverend Sophia, has said. She wants us to engage, and she wants us to center justice. And I think she also wants us to center love. So I think if we can take our deep breaths, look at the facts, sit with our feelings about those facts, because sometimes when you aren't aware of the facts and you see them, it's quite upsetting and quite disturbing. So that's what I think: centering justice, centering love, looking at facts, and really just trying to sit with them.
Thank you. And that's one of the reasons why we are committed here in this space and at the Church of the Larger Fellowship to continuing the ongoing conversation, because it's complex and it's not complex, right? It's
Yeah, it is. Well, I think another thing that you write a lot about, a lot of theology about this, is the concept of capitalism and is it good for people, and imperialism. And we're not a monolith. No group is a monolith. I'm sure we have UUs that think we can reform capitalism and things will be fine. We might have UUs that think a little imperialism is okay to keep the world safe for democracy. I wouldn't agree with that. But we're a community, and I think that if we look at the facts again and see there's a lot of weapons manufacturers involved in this whole situation, and their stock value has gone up. So I don't know if we should be for that. And
well,
Jeff, yeah,
it's certainly the case in the United States that if we haven't used our stockpile of bombs in a long enough time, the weapons manufacturers get antsy and start pressuring the government to use them somewhere.
yeah,
It's horrible.
yeah, very anti-life.
Right.
So, yeah, there's an American Israeli Jew named Jeff Halper that maybe some of our listeners have heard of. He's an anthropologist. He moved to Israel years ago. He still lives there. I guess he splits his time between the US and Israel. He wrote a fascinating book called War Against the People, which is very factual, and he just lays out all of the weapons development that the state of Israel has done and the fact that it tests weapons in Gaza. And although I know the claim is from a lot of people, it's trying to defend itself, it's trying to protect itself, I think we can also look at facts around that. It's a captive population. It's technically an occupation according to international law, which is another thing I encourage people to do, is be familiar with international law. Those are facts as well that the world community has agreed to, that there are rules of war, there are rules of occupation. If you are an occupying power, you have a duty to protect the people you are occupying. And is it really a war or is it an occupation? I mean, it sure looks like a war right now, but I think we have to really just insist on looking at what definitions are and what is the reality.
It's so interesting. There's so many conversations I've seen that get deep into semantics about these things. And one of those conversations was about the word war, because I think war implies powers that have a more equivalent level of power to each other. And part of, I think, what disturbs a lot of people is that this is not a symmetrical fight. Even if we start with, we believe that anti-Semitism is wrong and that killing Jewish civilians is wrong, and we start there, which is a fine place to start. Bombing refugee camps is not the answer to that, right? And that's
Yeah,
what
agreed.
or the day before. And bombing hospitals is not the answer to that. And we can go down rabbit holes of debate on who bombed what hospital, but there's a hospital that's in rubble. So,
Yeah.
and so how do we as Unitarian Universalists, many of whom are Jewish, many of whom are Muslim, if not also Palestinian, we have a big tent as Unitarian Universalists. How do we hold that complexity and still have a voice?
I think that it's interesting to think that we probably also have members that are Jewish and Arab.
Yeah.
Palestinian and Christian. We have,
Well, and that's why I started with that part of your bio that your husband's was raised Christian in Jerusalem.
mhm,
Is that there are not neat delineations here,
yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Well,
And I think another thing is a lot of people somehow feel that it's a religious conflict at the root. It is not a religious conflict.
right.
Yeah, there's religion involved. People involved have religion, they have a faith.
Hmm.
So both populations have secular people. I mean, there are secular Jews that are Israeli, there are secular Palestinians, we have humanists. Just like in the UU community, we have humanists. We're kind of a interesting tent, like you say. When my dad first met my future spouse, he said, "So I assume you're Muslim?" And my dad went to Star King School for the Ministry, and he was a minister for a while. Fairly well read person. And my husband, my future husband, smiled at him and said, "Well, we like to think of Jesus as one of our natural resources where I come from." And my poor dad just went like this and said, "Of course. What was I thinking?" We just have such a stereotype of Palestinians are all Muslim, and it's great that a lot of Palestinians are Muslim. That is true, but a lot of them are Christian too, and a lot of them are abstaining from religion. So I think it's important for us to perceive those multitudes, like you are saying. We have to have the 10,000-foot view, and that it's not an ancient conflict. It's not a war between Muslims and Jews that goes back thousands of years. Yes, there were wars in the past. Yes, there were atrocities in the past committed by every imaginable type of army, but we're talking about modern times. And in the 1900s, people lived together in relative peace and cooperation. And maybe the attitude then was, I don't want my child to marry someone from this other religion.
Hmm.
I'll do business with this person. I'll rent them a house. I'll cooperate with them on different things. And that was the reality there. And there were Palestinian Jews as well, and they all spoke Arabic. So it's a modern conflict. It's very much related to European colonialism. And the Europeans convinced the Palestinians and other Arabs to rise up against the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish occupation. And they said, in exchange, we'll give you some independent state. And then the uprising was successful. The Ottoman Empire was driven out. And then the European colonizers, surprise, surprise, said, no, we're not going to keep our promise. We're going to divide up the territory how we see fit, which is what colonizers do. So, and then they implemented other occupations by other nations, and a lot of conflict has resulted. So, this is the root of the modern conflict and the encouragement of the immigration of Jews who were suffering a lot of persecution in Europe for centuries. But some of the non Jewish leaders in Europe were not quiet about, we would like to see Jews leave Europe. So there was a lot of anti Semitism behind the impetus as well. And then people came and they didn't really try to integrate into the existing society. They tried to have more immigration and take over what was there. So this is where a lot of the anger comes from. And I don't know how many Unitarian Universalists know what happened in 1947 and 1948, that there were Zionist militias. The Zionists were the people that were pushing for the Jewish homeland. And some of them were brutal and committed atrocities. Again, facts, saying things like that can cause a lot of emotion. And I don't say it to offend anybody or to provoke anybody. There's a historian named Benny Morris, Israeli Jewish historian, that writes about these atrocities. So anyone can go find these facts and see what has happened over the years. And part of the atrocities included a village massacre, a village called Deir Yassin, which you can see the ruins of from the Yad Vashem site, which is so, I don't know if the word ironic is the right word, but it's sad to me that a place that was built to honor the souls that perished in the Holocaust is overlooking the site of such a horrible event.
And I think that's part of the root of the tragedy of the whole situation, right?
Mm,
Is that Israel was in part created or recreated, or however you want to like view it, as a response to the genocide of the Holocaust, the European genocide of Jewish
mhm.
people at first, and the trauma that lives in the bones and generations of our Jewish siblings is because of that genocide. And what's happening now is, and a lot of that emotion that you talk about
Mhm.
is related to that trauma, which is real. We,
Absolutely. It's part of the genetic structure at this point. People have written about that. Your bones remember the bones of your ancestors and what happened to them.
and so, as someone who has led an organization dedicated to justice in the Middle East, what are the hopeful points that you see? What if we were going to have a peaceful, just outcome? What might that be like?
I love that question. I think it's going to be up to the people that live there to figure it out. There's an organization called Zochrot, which means remembering in Hebrew, and they have dedicated themselves to teaching Israeli society about what happened to the Palestinians during the Nakba in the late 1940s. They have booklets about the villages that were depopulated and trees were planted over by the Jewish National Fund, pine trees mostly. I think people might remember that from their childhoods in synagogues, raising money for the trees. And so this group tries to educate the public about this because it was sort of forbidden for a while to talk about it. And they have also hosted some fascinating conferences of Palestinians and Israeli Jews imagining a shared future, imagining what does the right of return look like? Because again, going back to facts, definitions, modern times, international law, the United Nations has said refugees have the right to return to their homes. They won't all come back. Some will accept some kind of compensation or reparation, but what would it look like if the refugees could return and could feel welcomed to come back to where they were driven out? I went in May on a delegation with the American Friends Service Committee, and we went to many places. And one of the places we went to was a village that was depopulated in 1947, 1948. It was near Nazareth. Goes up a hill. There's a spring, like many villages back in those days. It had 800 people at that time, two churches and a mosque. There's even a funny story where the priest of the Roman Catholic Church said to the members of the Orthodox Christian Church, "I'll pay you to switch churches." And some people did. Anyway, they were driven out, and about 8,000 of the descendants live in Israel today. The land is not occupied. It has crumbled ruins. It has, I think, some kind of a military training center on the other side of a fence where the Christian cemetery for the village is located. But if those descendants wanted to return, there's space. They could do that. They're not allowed, though. They are not allowed to do that. They fought in the court system recently in the past few years to have the right to come back and hold wedding ceremonies in the churches.
Hmm.
So they've been able to do that, but there's no electricity. So they bring generators and lights and have music and dancing and feasting. So that is one answer about what the future would look like. I know a lot of people talk about a one democratic state solution. I think we have to recognize, though, that where is the population to support that? I think it's a great idea. I love that. Not to impose our religion's values on a population, but it sounds like something Unitarian Universalists would support. However, I think just as we are a justice seeking faith that has a wonderful group called Side with Love that tries to understand what are the facts we are working with. We are working in the United States with maybe 20% of our population is supporting the Christian dominionism philosophy. and they're trying to turn our country into a theocratic state based on some strange definition of Christianity that I think Jesus would be horrified to see. Just as we here have to understand what our demographics are when we're working for justice, we have to know what we're up against so that we can address it. It's the same thing in Israel and Palestine. You have to know what are the demographics, what are the percentage of people that are with the idea of a one democratic state, what percentage of people are even with the idea of two independent states. There is a disturbing percentage of Israeli Jews that are for population transfer. There was a study that was put out in May 2021 during the last big flare up in Gaza. They said they did a survey of Israeli citizens, Jews and Arabs. I think about 20% of the population of Israel is Palestinian Arab, which a lot of people also don't know, but I think people are learning. And the study said nearly half of religious and a quarter of secular Jews hate Arabs and believe that their citizenship should be revoked. So I don't know how it's changed since then, but I think a lot of people have a perception that even though the government of Israel has gone very right wing, that the population is completely different. And I don't think that's the case. I think it's kind of like here. You have a lot of people that are impacted by religious fundamentalism. And that is something we need to recognize, and we need to see what we can do to support the people that are working against that, like my friend Sahar. But does that sound like we could support one democratic state? It doesn't sound like that to me. To me, that's a future vision that I would love to see when the people there are ready for it and the majority ask for it. Otherwise, I don't think.
Is that though what the Jewish voices seeking peace and the Palestinian communities seeking peace, is that what they are envisioning though?
I believe what Jewish Voice for Peace says is it's really up to the people on the ground to make those decisions. That would be democracy. They don't call for a one state or a two state or a confederation.
I just wonder what forward thinking, peaceful people who actually live there.
Well, I think
Maybe
forward-thinking,
you can't
peaceful
answer
people
that.
right now are saying we need a ceasefire so that we can survive long enough to discuss what's going to happen next.
So dream one, let's stop killing each other.
But yeah, there's a spectrum of feeling in the Palestinian community. There are some that believe in the two-state solution. I think that percentage has gone down over the past few years because of the lack of hope. There are a lot who believe in the one democratic state. And then I think there's concern among the Jewish community. Does that mean that we're going to be thrown into the sea? Nobody is talking about throwing anybody into the sea. In fact, if you look at what happened in 1948, the Palestinians were actually thrown into the sea. They were forced onto boats out of their cities and towns along the coast, the Mediterranean coast, and ended up, unfortunately, many drowned. The ones that survived ended up in Lebanon, for the most part, in refugee camps and cannot return. So I think, again, facts, sitting with the discomfort around those facts. What I've heard in some nice UU webinars are get curious before you get furious. It might not be possible. Maybe you'll get furious first, but try to keep the curiosity open so that you can learn the facts. On our delegation in May, we met with 2 Israeli Jews who talked about their political organizations and what they believe in as a solution. One of the politicians, I forgot to write down her name, she said that we have to really recognize the amount of fear among the Israeli Jewish population.
Sure.
And you came out and said it. There's generational trauma and fear. And her opinion is we can't have one state until we have a period of separation and cooperation so that people can move past that fear.
Well, and people need to learn that a peaceful society is possible before they can let go of hatred, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I also think another problem, oh, and she was talking also about a confederation where maybe you'd have the Knesset in Israel, you'd have a Palestinian parliament in the Palestinian state, And then you would have another elected body that would handle some of the cooperation and commerce matters, I suppose, and security situations.
New York and Texas both have our own governments, and we're part of the same nation.
Yep. So she's a Jewish Israeli, and she feels like the Palestinians need to be centered in this discussion. And nothing's going to happen without cooperation. And I think the same article that I was quoting, they surveyed Arab Israelis, Palestinian Israelis, and the level of hate against the Jewish population was significantly less. So I think we also have bought into misinformation that there's a lot of hate on both sides, and that, like, again, this we're going to throw the Jews into the sea is the thing that we hear about the Palestinians, and nobody is saying that. Yeah, there are extremists everywhere.
Well, and
The
unfortunately,
vast majority are just like, I want to live my life, I want to be alive, I want to not be oppressed, I don't want to be occupied.
I think another part of the unfortunate situation is that extremists have undue power in all parts of this, and not proportional to the population that actually would agree with everything that they're doing.
I think there's also an attempt to demonize the Palestinian
Mhm.
resistance movement. There's an attempt to say it's the same as ISIS or Al Qaeda. Atrocities were committed. And I know that as a faith, we don't believe that that is something that is the entire Palestinian people.
Mhm.
I also think we need to remember that in times of war, our government lies. Remember the weapons of mass destruction, and Colin Powell actually came to the United Nations and said, we lied. We know that was a lie. Most Unitarian Universalists would agree and look at the destruction that resulted. So again, facts, do your research,
Yeah.
double check things that you hear in the news, and then wait, because things eventually come out that expand. Biden said he saw pictures of beheaded babies, and then he had to walk it back. No, I didn't actually see the pictures. No, they haven't been actually able to prove that. I don't think we want to get into the weeds a lot on proving this or that happened. We can just say, yes, atrocities happened, and we're not for it. And we need to work for a ceasefire so that people can stop being oppressed. And Ilan Pappé, an Israeli Jewish historian, has some really good videos out there, including some recent ones, where he was saying, we all know, according to international law, an occupied people has the right to resist by military means to military targets. Does that always happen? No, it does not. It gets ugly. He reminded us of Nat Turner, the revolts of the enslaved people, in which families were killed, white families were killed, men, women, and children. Haiti, what happened in Haiti, what some of the indigenous people in our country did while they were being genocided. There were massacres. It seems to be human nature. If you are severely repressed, the natural response is rage. And there will be people that do military resistance, that try to follow ethics, that try to follow international law, and there will be some that do not. So it seems to me the sooner we can stop the oppression, the sooner we can let the rage become less and let people have their independence.
It's hard to say those things without stirring up emotions.
Absolutely.
I just want to acknowledge that
Mhm.
I don't hear you trying to justify atrocities that have happened. You're not trying to say, well, they deserved it, but
Absolutely not.
understand why sometimes
Yeah.
things that we would rather not happen happened. And I think part of a ceasefire also needs to understand that people who are still being held hostage need to be returned. People who are being
Mhm.
imprisoned with no charges need to be released. Right? It's not just one party in this conflict to stop violence. Ceasefire is in all directions.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yes. And I'd like to mention my gratitude to Church of the Larger Fellowship for doing these programs on this topic. I think it's really part of helping UUs to engage better on this issue. I'd like to think of it as, can we be 5% more engaged in a congregation? We're not going to get from point A to point Z, whatever the goal would be of perfect ability to converse about this. But if we can make a little progress every day, every week, I think we can go a long way. I think UUs need to work on centering the Palestinian experience better. We don't have a lot of Palestinian UUs, I believe. We know of about maybe 6 or 7.
Yeah.
To my children who don't belong to a UU church, they were raised UU. I don't think Palestinians would perceive our religion as a safe space, whether because of, unconscious Islamophobia that we may be exhibiting. Those of us who are not Muslim, I know a lot of Muslim UUs get tired. I think there's a lot of parallels with Black and Indigenous and people of color UUs and microaggressions and just the biases that we have because of the water we swim in. But my daughter, my middle child, said her first question is, how will the UU community protect her heart as a Palestinian American? People almost feel like everything that they say about this situation, they have to preface it by saying they're not anti-Semitic. They condemn Hamas. They condemn Palestinian fighters. And a lot of people want to say, when did you condemn 1948? Vehemently, with vitriol. There's like even an emotional differential, as if the atrocities committed by Hamas are so much worse than what has been done to the Palestinians over the past 100 years. So I think that's like a mindset that we have to try to open up about a bit.
Yeah, and that's why I started with, we are going to come down on the side of the inherent worth and dignity of all people, right? And then we side with humanity in this,
Yeah.
the humanity of everyone, the Palestinian people, the Israeli people, Muslim people, Christian people, Jewish people, everyone. We have a question in our chat about why would we not want independent UN forces there, like in Cyprus, like peacekeeping?
It'd be a great idea. I think if we move to some kind of a what's next,
Yes.
we have to have United Nations. We have to have a peacekeeping force there. How do we get there after this particular catastrophe, which I believe is a genocide? And that's another term that probably provokes a lot of emotion for a lot of people. But I would say, look at the international definition. Does it fit? It does. Sit with your discomfort and do something about it. Take some action. Texas UU Justice Ministry, they are dedicated to helping people figure out how to call for a ceasefire, recognizing that this is the best way to protect the captives. If the bombing continues, the captives aren't going to survive. So
their Thursday action hours are open.
You can find it on the website, txuujm.org. So I think, yeah, UUs can try harder to figure out what they could do to center the Palestinian experience. While, of course, also we need to keep working on combating anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. But there's a concern of, when do we get to be centered just in our own right without all these disclaimers? And it's very harmful to people.
Again, it's interesting and complicated, right? If you look at the news in the United States, this has fueled anti-Semitic violence here, which spurs us to make those disclaimers. And it's people not connected to this who are using this situation to express their own hatred in a way that's like opportunist.
This conflict is going to increase anti-Semitic incidents. It's going to increase Islamophobic incidents because people are feeling rage and they're not going to be ethical or even follow the law. I follow someone named Laura Friedman on Twitter. She is a Jewish American with decades of experience in the State Department in the Middle East and lived there for a long time. She's Jewish. She's now the head of a group called Foundation for Middle East Peace, which has excellent webinars and speakers. And she would caution people about the reports from the Anti-Defamation League. And I recognize that a lot of people hold up the ADL as an organization that does a lot to combat hate, and it does. However, it is a very anti-Palestinian organization. And what her report said is they are using harmful definitions of anti-Semitism to compile their reports. So, according to some organizations, if you criticize Israel, it's anti-Semitic. If you have a poster that says Free Palestine, it's anti-Semitic. I don't want to belittle any of the actual anti-Semitic incidents that are happening. You know, swastikas being drawn, firebomb threats, actual violence against Jewish people, horrible remarks, that kind of thing. But to conflate all of these things with anti-Semitism ends up producing a report that makes it seem so much more prevalent than it is. So that's a tricky thing to say, because again, I don't want to belittle what's happening that is harming Jewish people. But I think this conflation is dangerous, and it has a chilling impact on advocacy for Palestinian rights.
You start with the fact that anti-Semitism is real and violent and dangerous to our Jewish siblings. That's an acknowledgement. And it has to be okay to criticize the actions of the state of Israel without being anti-Semitic. It has to be okay.
Yeah.
So we have a couple more folks in our chat as we wrap up. Pat says, after the U.S. made slavery illegal, Black Americans did not rise up and kill white Americans. A Palestinian person recently told Pat, quote, people will see how forgiving Palestinians are when we are free. And Alice, who is also in our chat, says, I think that in the same breath, we honor the generational trauma of Jews. We need Israelis to acknowledge the generational trauma of Palestinians. And I think that's right.
Mm-hmm.
And the disproportionate violence that is happening right now is furthering that trauma.
Yeah, it's
right?
true. It's true. But I think the majority of the world wants to see support for Palestinian freedom, whatever that looks like, without abusing any other population.
Yeah.
And I think the world is changing. It's becoming a multipolar world. I feel like we mentioned before capitalism and imperialism. Those forces want to be able to dominate the Middle East. They want to be able to control the markets. They are relying on Israel to be the partner in this project. And it doesn't look very good right now. It doesn't look like it's working. It might has a threat of becoming a regional war. I see in the chat, somebody said the hatred will get worse. Yes, it will. The rage will get worse. I'm one who believes that once we get past the ceasefire, there has to be some radical change. We can't go back to the status quo. We can't go back to a blank check for military aid that's using our tax dollars to kill people. And I also have concern for the souls of the Israeli soldiers. When you raise generations to have this fear and this hate that you find in so many, what does it do to their souls? That's not fair to them. And I lift up a group called Breaking the Silence, which is a group of former Israeli soldiers that have kind of seen the light, and they denounce what has been happening, and they try to encourage a better way. A book by Reverend Dr. Teresa Cooley. She's been to Israel and Palestine with a group from her church, and she had some specialized training at Harvard University on conflict resolution, which is kind of what conversations in our churches and congregations will be like. And her book is called Transforming Conflict, the Blessings of Congregational Turmoil. So I'd like us to see this as a blessing, that we're finally maybe opening up more and really trying to engage in this in a meaningful way, not silence the discussion, and try to hold each other as human beings, recognize the humanity as we try to traverse progress on this topic.
Well, thank you so much for being part of this conversation, Dana.
Gracias por joining us. Special thanks to those of you who give generously to this ministry, be it time, talent, or treasure. It is because of you that this ministry is possible. You can click the link in the description to give now, or visit clfuu.org/podcast for more information. If you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to subscribe, rate, and review so that others can find us. Thanks again for listening.